At 2:47 in the afternoon on June 18th, 1943, Oberreiter Klaus Weber stood in the back of an American Army truck watching palm trees drift past through the canvas opening, trying to make sense of what was happening. He was 24 years old, captured 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship. He had been expecting a prison camp like the ones from the propaganda films, dark cells, interrogations, starvation portions. Instead, the truck was rolling west from Camp Blanding towards something the American guards were calling Lake Geneva. Weber had no idea what that meant. The guard, sitting across from him, a corporal named Matthews, was eating an orange and grinning. Matthews had told Weber and the other 11 Germans in the truck that they were going swimming. Weber was certain he'd misunderstood the English. Swimming. In the middle of a war, in the middle of captivity, none of it added up. Weber had surrendered to British forces on May 12th near Tunis. His unit, the 21st Panzer Division, had been encircled for 3 days. No food, no ammunition, no chance of rescue. When British tanks rolled through their position, Weber and 140 other men walked out with their hands up. The British were straightforward about it. They fed the prisoners, gave them water, processed them through a collection point where thousands of German and Italian soldiers sat in wire enclosures waiting to be moved. Weber spent 9 days there before being loaded onto a ship bound for America. The voyage took 17 days. The Liberty ship carried 800 German prisoners in the cargo holds. Not brutal, but not comfortable either. Too many men crammed into too little space. Seasickness, heat, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the constant dread that a U-boat might torpedo the ship without knowing Germans were on board. When the ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia, on June 9th, Weber had lost 14 pounds. American military police marched the prisoners onto trains. Weber's group travelled south through Virginia, through the Carolinas, into Georgia, and finally into Florida. The landscape shifted as they went. Pine forests gave way to swamps, then to flat stretches of sand and scrub palmetto. The heat thickened. By the time they reached Camp Blanding on June 11th, Weber understood he was somewhere tropical, somewhere nothing like home, somewhere he'd likely stay until the war ran its course. Camp Blanding covered 170,000 acres of land northeast of Stark, Florida. The base had been built in 1939 as a training facility for American infantry. By 1943 it was also holding German prisoners of war. Weber and his group were processed through the P compound on the western edge of the base, photographed, fingerprinted, issued clean uniforms, American field jackets dyed with large PW markings on the back, canvas shoes, 2 blankets, a mess kit. They were assigned to wooden barracks with screened windows and tin roofs, 20 men per building. Each man got a cot, a footlocker, and a small shelf. Weber had been expecting concrete cells and searchlight towers. What he found looked more like a summer camp. The barracks were clean, the latrines had running water, the mess hall served hot food 3 times a day. On his first night at Camp Blanding, Weber ate beef stew, white bread, canned peaches, and real coffee. More food than he'd seen in the last 6 months of fighting in North Africa. He sat at a long table with other prisoners and tried to work out what kind of prison handed its inmates beef stew and coffee. A sergeant named Hoffman, another prisoner who'd been at Blanding for 2 months, laid it out plainly. America had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive the same quality of food, housing, and medical care as the capturing nation's own soldiers. America was following the rules. The prisoners would work, but they'd be paid 80 cents a day in camp script, redeemable at the canteen. 8-hour days with rest periods, adequate food and clothing. No beatings, no torture, no executions. Hoffman delivered all of this in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, while finishing his beef stew, and Weber realized the man wasn't spinning a tale. This was policy. Work began on June 14th. Weber and 50 other prisoners were trucked to citrus groves 20 miles west of camp. The grove went on for miles, endless rows of orange trees heavy with fruit. The foreman, an American civilian named Patterson, explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner was assigned 30 boxes to fill. Each box held up to 100 pounds of oranges. Pick carefully, don't bruise the fruit, stack the full boxes at the end of each row. Hours were 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, with a 1-hour lunch break. Finish your 30 boxes early and you were done for the day. Rest in the shade. Patterson made it clear that working fast helped the prisoners, not just the growers. Weber started picking at 8:15 that first morning. Simple work, but physically punishing. Reach up, grab an orange, twist and pull. Lower it gently into the canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. When the bag filled, empty it into a wooden box. Repeat. The Florida sun was merciless. By 9 o'clock, his shirt was soaked through. By 10, his shoulders ached from all the overhead reaching. By 11, he understood exactly why Patterson had emphasized speed. The sooner he filled those boxes, the sooner he stopped. His first box was done by 9:30. His second by 10:45. He was getting quicker, falling into the rhythm. Pick, twist, pull, place. Don't overthink it, just move. By noon he had 9 boxes filled. Lunch came at 12. The prisoners gathered in the shade of a big oak near the packing shed. Guards handed out sandwiches, bread with cheese, and some kind of meat Weber couldn't quite place along with as many oranges as anyone wanted. Weber ate 2 sandwiches and 3 oranges, drank water from a canteen. The guards refilled at a pump near the shed, then leaned back against the oak and watched the American guards sitting nearby, eating the exact same food. One of them, a private named Kowalski, offered Weber a cigarette. American tobacco. Lucky strike. Weber took it. They smoked quietly for a few minutes before Kowalski asked in broken German where Weber was from. Munich, Weber said. Kowalski said his grandparents had come from Bavaria before the First World War. Small talk between enemies during a lunch break in a Florida orange grove. Weber couldn't square it with everything he'd been told about Americans, that they were weak, cruel, cultureless, without honor. Kowalski was just a man from Pennsylvania who missed his family and wanted the war to end so he could go home. That was all. Weber went back to picking at 1 o'clock. He filled his remaining 21 boxes by 4:20, stacked the last one at the end of his row, and walked to the packing shed to report. Patterson checked the boxes, counted them, marked Weber's name on a clipboard. Done. 40 minutes early. Weber sat under the oak with 7 other prisoners who'd also finished and waited for the truck. That night in the barracks, Hoffman mentioned that the weekend would be different. Saturdays and Sundays were rest days, no work. Prisoners could sleep, play cards, attend religious services, or join whatever recreational activities the camp put together. Weber asked what kind of recreation. Hoffman grinned. Sometimes they let us swim. Weber thought he was joking. He wasn't. On Saturday, June 19th at 2:30 in the afternoon, an American sergeant named Daniels walked through the P compound calling for 12 volunteers for a swimming trip to Lake Geneva. Supervised activity, 2 hours, back by 5 o'clock. Weber put his hand up. He hadn't been swimming since his teenage years in Bavaria. The idea of swimming in an American lake as a prisoner of war was absurd on its face. But Hoffman had said it was real, and Weber needed to see that for himself. That's how he ended up in the back of that truck at 2:47, watching palm trees slide past through the canvas opening while Corporal Matthews ate an orange and grinned. The truck drove for 20 minutes before stopping at the edge of Lake Geneva, maybe 300 yards across. Clear water, sandy bottom visible near the shore, pine trees on 3 sides. Matthews and two other guards walked the prisoners down to the water's edge. The prisoners were still in their PW-marked uniforms. Matthews said they could swim in their clothes or in their underwear, whatever they preferred, most stripped to their underwear. Weber kept his pants on but pulled off his shirt. The water was warm. He waded into his waist, then dove forward and swam. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this feeling water all around him, weightlessness, the quiet below the surface. He swam 10 yards underwater before coming up for air. The other prisoners were splashing near the shore. Some of them were laughing, real laughter. Weber couldn't remember the last time he'd heard a German soldier laugh. The guards watched from shore, rifles slung over their shoulders, but relaxed. They were talking among themselves, smoking cigarettes, calling out occasionally to keep the men within the designated area. Weber flipped onto his back and stared up at the sky. The Florida sky was different from North Africa, cleaner, bluer, no dust hanging in the air. He thought about the last 3 years. Joining the Wehrmacht in 1940. Training in Poland. Deployed to North Africa in early 1942. 18 months of fighting across Libya and Tunisia. The constant fear, the constant hunger, the constant noise of artillery and aircraft and small arms fire, then capture, then the ship, then this floating in a lake in Florida while American guards let him swim without chains or threats. There was splashing nearby. Matthews had waded in up to his knees, laughing at something another guard had said. Then he dove in and swam past Weber, heading toward the center of the lake. A sergeant, whose name Weber didn't know, followed. Within 5 minutes, 3 American guards were swimming alongside 12 German prisoners. Not together exactly, but sharing the same water, the same space, the same moment of relief inside a war that had already killed millions and would kill millions more before it ended. Weber climbed out after 30 minutes. He sat on the sandy shore and took in the scene. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wars weren't supposed to have moments where enemies played in water side by side, but here it was, undeniable. At 4:15, Matthews called the prisoners out of the water. Time to go back. The prisoners dressed, climbed into the truck, and rode back to Camp Blanding in silence. Weber had nothing to say that could make sense of the afternoon. That night in the barracks he wrote a letter to his mother in Munich. The letters were censored, so he couldn't write about anything military, no camp locations, no details that might help Germany. Just general conditions and his health. He wrote that he was safe, that the Americans were treating him well, that he had gone swimming that afternoon. He knew she wouldn't believe that last part. He barely believed it himself. But it had happened. The swimming trips continued throughout that summer. Once or twice a month, depending on schedules and guard availability, prisoners who had met their weekly quotas could volunteer for supervised outings to Lake Geneva or nearby lakes. Always the same setup: 12 prisoners, 3 guards, 2 hours, back by evening. The guards always carried their rifles. They never really needed them. No prisoner ever tried to escape on these trips. Where would they go? Middle of Florida, hundreds of miles from any neutral territory, wearing uniforms with PW stamped on the back. Escape was theoretically possible. Practically, it was pointless, and honestly, most prisoners didn't want to go anywhere. The conditions at Camp Blanding were better than what they'd had during the final weeks of the North African campaign. Better food, better shelter, no combat, no officers screaming, no constant threat of dying. Some prisoners called it a golden cage, comfortable but still confinement. Weber had a different name for it. He called it a chance to survive. The alternative was returning to Germany, which by mid-1943 was being bombed around the clock by Allied aircraft. The alternative was the Eastern Front, which was swallowing entire German armies whole in battles that made North Africa look like a training drill. The alternative was death. So Weber picked oranges, showed up for swimming trips when he could, played chess in the barracks, and waited. The work in the citrus groves ran through June and July. Weber got fast. By his third week, he was filling his 30 boxes by 3 in the afternoon. 2 hours to sit under the oak tree, eat oranges, and watch the guards. The guards rotated. Some were friendly, some indifferent. None were cruel. Weber noticed that many were older men, too old for combat, or younger men classified unfit for overseas service due to injuries or medical conditions. Garrison duty in Florida instead of a front line somewhere. Some of them seemed embarrassed by the assignment. They wanted to be out there proving themselves. Weber thought they'd drawn the better card. They were alive. They'd go home when it was over. That mattered more than any medal. In August the work shifted. The citrus harvest was winding down. Patterson told the prisoners they'd be reassigned. Some went to logging camps in northern Florida. Others to construction on military facilities. Weber's group was sent to a Minute Maid processing plant going up near Winter Haven. The plant would produce frozen concentrated orange juice, a new technology the military wanted for supplying troops overseas. The prisoners worked construction, pouring concrete, laying bricks, installing plumbing. Same hours, 8 to 5, but harder work than picking fruit. Weber had no construction background. He learned on the job. The American civilian contractors were patient. They showed him each task, corrected mistakes without anger, paid the same 80 cents a day in script. By September, Weber had saved $60 in script. He spent it at the canteen on cigarettes, candy bars, and writing paper. The canteen also sold Coca-Cola, which Weber tried once and decided tasted like medicine. The other prisoners disagreed loudly. They loved it, bought it by the case, and drank it during card games in the barracks. Weber stuck to water. News from Europe came in through newspapers and radio broadcasts in the recreation hall, which the guards allowed prisoners to use. By September 1943, Italy had surrendered. Mussolini had been overthrown, and the new Italian government had switched sides. German forces in Italy were now fighting alone against Americans and British pushing north from Sicily. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing after the catastrophe at Kursk. Germany was losing, not fast, but inevitably. Weber saw it before most of the others. He'd studied the maps, run the numbers, counted the divisions. Germany could not win a three-front war against enemies with more men and more factories. The only real question was how long it would drag on and how many more would die before Germany admitted it was over. Weber quietly hoped the end would come before he was sent home. Being a prisoner in Florida was far better than being a soldier in Berlin when the Red Army arrived. In October the swimming trips stopped. The weather had cooled, though cooler in Florida meant temperatures in the 70s rather than the 90s. The guards said the lakes were too cold. Weber didn't think 70 degrees was too cold, but he didn't push back. The trips had always been a privilege, not a right, and privileges could be taken away without explanation. The camp shifted to other activities: soccer matches between barracks, chess tournaments, film screenings in the recreation hall. The films were American, mostly westerns and musicals with German subtitles added by the camp administration. Weber watched one called Stagecoach, starring someone named John Wayne he'd never heard of, cowboys and Indians, and a coach being chased across the desert. Ridiculous, he thought, but entertaining. The other prisoners were absolutely captivated. They talked about John Wayne for weeks. The food stayed solid through 1943 and into early 1944. Beef, chicken, potatoes, bread, vegetables, canned fruit, coffee, the same rations American soldiers received. The prisoners put weight back on. Weber had arrived at Camp Blanding weighing 140 pounds. By January 1944 he was 162. You could see it in his face, his arms, the way he carried himself. He was no longer the hollowed-out soldier who had surrendered in Tunisia. He was healthier than he'd been in 3 years. Then came May 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was finished. 3 days later, the camp administration cut the prisoner rations, smaller meals. Less meat, more bread and potatoes. Colonel Hayes, the camp commander, called an assembly and explained. News had come through about the German concentration camps, photographs of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers. The American public was furious. Congress was pressing for reduced rations as a form of punishment. Hayes said he personally disagreed with the policy but had no latitude. Orders from Washington were unambiguous. Cut the rations, hold to the minimum Geneva Convention standards, keep the work assignments going. The prisoners received the news without protest. What was there to say? They hadn't known about the camps. Most insisted they'd had no idea. Weber had heard rumours during his time in the Wehrmacht talk of camps in Poland, trainloads of people being sent east, things soldiers weren't supposed to discuss. He had dismissed it. Told himself it was propaganda, exaggerations meant to make Germany look monstrous. But the photographs weren't exaggerations. The piles of bodies weren't exaggerations. Weber sat in his barracks after the assembly and tried to hold two things in his mind at once. He had been a soldier fighting in North Africa, not a camp guard. He hadn't personally done those things. But he had worn the uniform, served the regime, followed orders. That made him part of it, even if only at the edges. That weight wasn't something he could just put down. The other prisoners didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to focus on going home, on rebuilding, on moving forward. Weber couldn't move forward that cleanly. Those photographs stayed with him. The rations improved again by September 1945. After the initial public outrage faded, the camp administration restored full meals. But the mood had shifted. The guards were more distant now, more formal. The easy casual friendliness was gone. The swimming trips never came back. Recreation continued, but the atmosphere was different. The war was over. The reckoning was just getting started. Weber stayed at Camp Blanding until March 1946. Repatriation was slow. Thousands of German prisoners were scattered across camps all over America, and shipping them back required coordination with British and French authorities, who were also managing millions of displaced people. Weber's turn came on March 12th. He and 300 other prisoners boarded buses to Jacksonville, then a Liberty ship bound for France. The voyage took 14 days. Weber spent most of it on deck staring at the ocean, turning the past 3 years over in his mind. He had left Germany in 1942 as a soldier. He was going back in 1946 as a former prisoner, carrying memories of picking oranges and swimming in a Florida lake while American guards ate sandwiches and talked about home. The ship docked at Cherbourg on March 26th. French authorities processed the prisoners, then loaded them onto eastbound trains toward Germany. Weber reached Munich on April 3rd. The city was in ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The streets were filled with displaced people, refugees, former soldiers trying to locate their families. Weber found his mother living in a basement apartment in what was left of their old neighborhood. His father had been killed in an air raid in 1944. His younger brother had died on the Eastern Front in 1945. His mother had survived by working in a uniform factory until that too was bombed. She was 52 years old and looked 70. Weber moved in with her and looked for work. There was none. The economy was rubble. The currency was worthless. People traded cigarettes and canned food instead of money. Weber drew on what he'd learned in Florida. He found odd jobs in construction, repairing buildings, hauling away debris. The pay was almost nothing, but it was enough to buy food on the black market. He worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, helping to rebuild a city that would take decades to fully recover. He never talked about Florida. When people asked where he'd been during the war, he said North Africa and left it there. But he thought about Florida often. He thought about Lake Geneva, about the warm water, about floating on his back while American guards watched from shore. He thought about Corporal Matthews eating an orange and grinning. He thought about the sheer absurdity of enemies swimming together in the middle of a war that had killed 60 million people. And slowly he arrived at something. The Americans hadn't been trying to humiliate him by letting him swim. They'd been trying to remind him that he was still a person. That war doesn't cancel your humanity. That even as an enemy, even in captivity, you're still owed basic dignity. That was what he carried forward. Not that America was perfect. Not that the war itself was justified, just that even in the worst of it, humanity can survive if people choose to protect it. Weber lived in Munich for the rest of his life. He married in 1949, had 3 children, worked as a construction foreman, and eventually started his own small contracting business. He never went back to America, never tried to track down any of the guards from Camp Blanding. But he kept one thing from those years, a faded photograph taken at Lake Geneva on that June afternoon in 1943. In it, 12 German prisoners stand on a sandy shore, wet, smiling, looking more like men on holiday than enemies in captivity. Weber kept the photograph in a desk drawer. His children found it after he died in 1987. They asked their mother what it was. She told them their father had been a prisoner of war in America and that the Americans had treated him well, better than he'd expected. Better, she said quietly, than he probably deserved. The photograph now sits in a small museum in Munich, dedicated to the experiences of German soldiers and prisoners during the Second World War. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like any other group photo from that era. Men standing together, smiling, caught in a quiet moment. But it isn't ordinary at all. It's a photograph of enemies who were allowed to be human for 2 hours on a summer afternoon in Florida. Proof that, even in war, even in captivity, even between nations doing their level best to destroy each other, humanity can survive. If people choose to let it. If this story moved you the way it moves us, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm to show this to more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're dropping forgotten stories like this every day. Real history, real people, real moments of humanity in impossible situations. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the UK, Australia? Our community stretches across the whole world. Tell us you're here. Tell us if someone in your family served during the Second World War. Just let us know you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Weber and the thousands of others who lived through this strange kind of mercy are not forgotten. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.